Hello everyone, welcome to History NCERT series by PMFIS. In the last few lectures, we have already covered second and third chapter of Class 8 NCERT. Those who are watching this class, if they keep their NCERT textbook in front of them, it would be helpful for you. In this lecture, we are going to see this fourth chapter, that is Tribals, Dikus and the Vision of Golden Age. So remember, we have already covered in the first lecture how East India Company came to India as a trader and finally established their political power in India. In the second chapter, in the second lecture, we have already discussed these three systems of land revenue, that is permanent system, Rayatwari system and Mahalwari system. In the third lecture, we have discussed about how Indian cultivators were cultivating the crop which Europeans needed for their company or industries in the Europe. So this is the fourth chapter, and in this chapter we are going to learn about the how East India Company or British rule in India affected the tribal people. So remember, when East India Company started trade in India and finally became political power in India, they devised various policies like socio-cultural policy, economic policy. They also introduced the English as a medium in the education. So these various policies affect various sections of people in India. Similarly, certain policies affected the tribal people, and ultimately whether these civilians or peasants or tribal people, they resisted and culminated into the revolt. If you read these terms, revolt, uprising, rebellion, all are same. Means all the resistance were finally culminated into revolt. Revolt means resistance or protest on a larger scale, mostly violent, by a group of people against person or establishment, means against government. So you already know what is meant by revolt. You can use this alternatively. Both means all these terms, revolt, uprising and rebellion, in general are same. They are not same, but in general you can consider it the same. But in certain few tribal languages, if you see these terms hul or ulgulun, these are also used for this revolt. So in this particular chapter, this fourth chapter, we are going to see how the East India Company's rule in India, British rule in India, affected these tribal peoples. So tribal, how did tribal live? Tribal before British, tribal under the British, and impact of British rule on tribal lives. Next, Dikus. Who are these Dikus? Dikus means outsider. Outsiders like zamindar, moneylender, European planters and all these things. Why tribal consider these outsiders as enemies? We will going to learn in this chapter. And last is vision of golden age. Means the vision of tribals to establish their Raj, their tribal Raj in their region. So we are going to see these three things: tribals, how East India Company's rule in the India affected the tribal, why these Dikus are considered or outsiders are considered as enemies, and their vision for the golden age, means establishment of tribal Raj in India. Remember, the forest is essential for the tribals because tribal life was ultimately connected to the forest. If you see, many tribals were zoom cultivators. Zoom cultivators means they were doing the shifting cultivation. They cut the trees, then burn the vegetation, and they use land for the cultivation. They spread this ash from firing which contains potash to fertilize the soil. They did not use the plow. They directly scattered these seeds, and once the crop is ready and harvesting is done, they left this land uncultivated for several years to generate the fertility, means natural fertility of soil. So in the forest, these tribals were doing this zoom cultivation or shifting cultivation. So mostly they dependent on this forest. Again, some tribals were hunters and gatherers, means they did this animal hunting and food gatherings which are required for their survival. Some tribals were involved in animal rearing, herding of the animals. So overall, tribals thought that they had this customary right to use the minor forest produce, and this forest was essential for them. When this forest produce was reduced, then only they worked as a laborer in tea plantation and coal mines. Means they used the land outside the forest only when there was decrease in this forest produced. For most of the times, they mostly dependent on the forest for their survival. Now you know most of the tribals were dependent on the forest. So forest was ultimately important for them, not only for the economical purpose, they also see a spiritual source in the forest. So they consider forest as their own land. But some tribals even started during that time the settled cultivation. Settled cultivation means, as opposed to this zoom cultivation or shifting cultivation, they settled in single place. They use this plow, means unlike this shifting cultivation, they did not roam from one place to another place. Instead of that, they started this settled cultivation. And if you see the British attitude, British officials saw the settled tribal group as more civilized. Why more civilized? Because if these tribals or forest people are settled in the land, it is easy for British to control and administer them. It is easy for them to have this regular revenue source, means they can get this land revenue easily. So British preferred this settled tribal groups. But remember, most of the tribes in India during that time were dependent on forest. If you consider the impact of British rule on tribal lives, before British came to India, tribals had this customary right in the forest. They were completely dependent on forest. But once British came to India, because of this forest policy curtailed most of the tribal right. Even British declared some of this forest as a reserved forest. If one forest is declared as a reserve forest by the British, this forest people or tribal people could not do zoom cultivation, which was required for their daily survival. Even the roaming or collecting fruits or hunting animal was banned. So because of this British rules, the forest life was, tribal's life was getting affected. That's why, as a result, these tribal groups were forced to move to other region in search of work. Mostly they went on out of the forest and work in the tea plantation in Assam or mines in the Jharkhand. If you see another impact, earlier the tribal economy was isolated and self-sufficient. During this British rule, because of the development of roadways, railways, postal system, telegraph system, every market was interlinked. Even this forest market was linked, forest economy or tribal economy was linked to the market. So they were dependent on this market, and British introduced these zamindars, money lenders, even in the forest. So once they introduced these zamindars were, we have already seen in the zamindari system, zamindars were recognized as a landowner. So zamindar became owners of the land and tribal were just tenants. Similarly, if this tribal economy is now or forest produce is connected to the market, so we have already seen that money lenders first gave money and finally these tribes will be in the debt trap. Same happened here also. Money lenders exploited tribals by charging high interest rate. That's why these tribes or tribal people consider these zamindars, money lenders or Europeans or planters as a outsider and enemy, that is Dikus. They consider these Dikus as a source of their misery. Next is impact of British rule. Tribal chiefs. Earlier, one powerful among these tribal people were administrating the land and controlling entire land, tribal land. But during this British rule, even this tribal chief had to follow the rules of East India Company or Britishers. So overall, this British system, they have affected the tribals worst. Means the British rule was disadvantageous for these tribals. If you see struggle faced by tribal laborers, means whenever the forest produce was decreased, they work in the tea plantation or they work in the coal mines. But there were also problem of low wages, long working hour, working in the suffocating mines. All these were problems affecting these tribal people. So now you know, as we have already seen this land revenue system, peasants were exploited. Similarly, because of the various policies of British, these tribes or tribal peoples were getting affected. So finally, these tribal people resisted and there were many revolts or uprisings during this 19th century. Now we are going to see particularly this Munda Ulgulan. I have already told you Ulgulan or Hul, these are alternative terms for this revolt. So Munda revolt. Before we see this revolt, just see this Birsa Munda, the leader of the revolt. Birsa Munda. Birsa Munda was born on 15th November 1875 into a poor Munda tribal family. Now Government of India has declared this as a Janjatiya Divas. 15th November. In 1895, Birsa declared that God had appointed him to save his people from slavery of Dikus. Means Birsa Munda claimed that God has appointed him to free his people from these outsiders. Who were outsiders? Zamindars, moneylenders, Europeans. So many tribals, not just this from this Munda tribe, outside like Santals and all were following this Birsa Munda, because Birsa promised that I was appointed by, means Birsa was appointed by God to save his people. Later Birsa declared that he himself was a god or Bhagwan and started his religion Birsite. Initially Birsa Munda more focused on the reforms within this society. So he urged his followers to give up drinking liquor, clean their villages, etc. So initially it was just a reform. But if you see this Munda Rebellion, Birsa Munda promised their followers that he was appointed by God to free from the slavery of this Dikus. So he wanted to drive outsiders or Dikus such as moneylenders, landlords and government and set up the Munda Raj with Birsa Munda at its head. Munda Raj means tribal authority. In 1899, Birsa proclaimed a rebellion to establish Munda rule in the land. He urged his followers to destroy Ravana. Ravana means Dikus plus European and establish kingdom under his leadership. Remember, now they have started this revolt, but this fighting or this war was not equal because Britishers or Europeans were having these modern weapons, but as opposed to this, Birsa's followers, they were fighting with swords, spears, bows and arrows. So basically that was not a fair competition. They attacked the police station, churches and raided the property of moneylenders and zamindar. Because it was basically against this outsider, they raised the white flag as a symbol of Birsa Raj. But unfortunately, Birsa was captured in February 1900 and he died of cholera while in jail. So once after his death, the movement was finally faded, means the movement was gradually ended. But if you see all these 18th and 19th century tribal revolts, they were fighting against these Britishers to establish their own rule, to establish their tribal authority, to have this tribal autonomy in the forest area or tribal area. So in this lecture we have covered first how this British rule in India affected this tribal people and how tribal people responded with revolt. In this lecture we have basically seen this Munda Rebellion. So if you think that I am not covering in too depth, this is not the case. We are just covering what is given in NCERT. These are the points from the directly taken from the NCERT and useful for your state exam as well as UPSC. So in the next lecture we will see the next chapter, that is chapter 5 of class 8. For better understanding, once this lecture is over, please try to read the textbook, NCERT textbook line by line. So see you in next lecture.